Welcome, everybody. What a great crowd. Thank you for coming out in this cold weather. I started this research last year after the talk I gave because a woman came up and asked what I knew about her property here in town. And I knew a little, but hadn't gotten into it in depth. And unfortunately, she's not here tonight. So first I want to acknowledge that a lot of other people have done a lot of research in what we'll call Black history area, besides the Romney history area. And so I probably overlap with some people, but maybe you all don't know this, and maybe you'll like to hear it again. So, and I might not always be right, but I'm trying to just deal with the facts. So we'll see. I use Find a Grave. I love the Find a Grave website. You can get lots of information that way. I use the internet. I use the historichampshire.org, old newspapers online, like the Review. So, and if I'm not careful, I get distracted and go off down in some rabbit hole.
Yeah, don't we all?
So let's see. When I looked up history of slavery in West Virginia, Wikipedia came up with an article, which was very interesting. But just briefly, before the Civil War, there was a big movement in the United States to send African Americans back to Africa, and a country called Liberia was created for that purpose. We actually sent 9 slaves back from Hampshire County and 184 from West Virginia, and this is documented. Turns out it didn't work out so well. There was a big problem with malaria and other things, so it's unclear how many of them actually survived, although, in fact, some of them did, because Liberia is still there with the descendants. So some documents I found a website, USGen or one of those sort of things, which had a list of inventory from 1850 of slave owners in Hampshire County. And I created a spreadsheet, that's what I do. But basically, there's a lot of family names that you would recognize. Basically, there were about, in 1850, there were about 1,435 slaves with 292 slave owners.
In Hampshire County?
In Hampshire County. 23 of those were women, and the other 269 were men.
Were women allowed?
The
Women,
owners.
yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a big history of women owning property and stuff. And it's just like you couldn't necessarily go to court on your own behalf and things like that, but like you could inherit property and all kinds of stuff. So there were actually some pretty powerful women, it looks like, along the way. The average number of slaves per those slave owners was actually only 5 slaves. However, Samuel Brady looked like he had the most, and he had 47 slaves.
Wow.
John Brady, who may have been his brother, but I don't remember right now if he was actually related, he had 22. Most of them didn't have very many. An interesting thing reading the old newspapers online is you'll find that you could actually rent slaves from other slave owners. So some of them had slaves just so they could rent them out and make money that way. They didn't necessarily need them for their own property. And in 1871, Reverend O.P. Wergman, I think his name was Octavius, he bought several acres of land from Tobias Baker and created Holtzville, what became called Holtzville. And Holtzville Street still exists. If you go west on Rosemary, just like 2 blocks out of town, you don't know you're out of town, but from the historic district. What he did was sold plots of land to former slaves, so they could have a home. And there was a lot of names there, like that you would recognize. Alexander Singleton. The Singleton family will show up in my other research. So there was a big ex-slave community there. Although it's hard to tell exactly, the deeds don't say necessarily former slaves, stuff like that. So it's hard to tell, but you can pretty much guess that most African Americans in this area in the 1870s had been slaves or were just freeborn after the war. Interestingly, not very many of them are buried at Mount Pisgah, according to known records. And I did run across reference, besides the Mount Pisgah Cemetery, which I'll talk about. I did run across reference to some of the African Americans being buried in the Ebenezer Cemetery. The Indian Mound Cemetery was segregated, so anyone buried there, when I'm doing my research and it's not clear, because they don't say, oh, this is the colored person buying this property. If they weren't buried, if they were buried at Indian Mound, then I can tell that that's not from the African American community. And it's fun things traveling through the old review. I haven't been able to find out anything about this, but in 1935, there's a reference to a famous painting of an old darky couple, and the painting's called Hard Lines, and it's by someone named Henry, and then I'm not sure, it's spelled M something R something N, Morin, something like that. And I haven't been able to find him by Googling either. And it says in the review that it was Uncle Chance and Aunt Chloe who lived in Romney. And I can't find anyone with those names either. But it's fun finding those little tidbits of the community. So the lot that started this particular focus is lot 93, which is on East Birch, right by the School for the Deaf and Blind. And the woman asked me, she'd heard that there were slaves there and wanted to know more. And so I looked it up, and indeed, there were various famous people who owned the property before. John Jack, who owned, I think he owned this lot, well, lots of other lots. And then Warner Throckmorton, who at one time was the owner of the, what we call the Kern House now. And Sam Kercheval Jr. owned it for a little while, and he's the son of the Sam Kercheval who wrote the book about life back in the time of the Revolutionary War. In 1857, Daniel Shawwin bought the property, and he had a lot of other properties, like hundreds of acres and everything, so I don't know if this was where he lived when he was in town or what. He is listed in that spreadsheet of slave owners as owning 5 slaves in 1850. He bought the property in 1857. In 1875, Benjamin Pugh bought it. He was an auctioneer and may have been involved in some other businesses in town. Men didn't use their first names a lot of times. They would have a business of Gilkerson, Pugh, and somebody. It's like, well, which ones? Or they just say S.H. Williamson. It's like really hard to track them down, but you can. The Pugh family, in 1850, 5 of them were listed as having a total of 6 slaves. They didn't have very many, but they did have slaves. Benjamin, however, is not listed as having slaves at that time. So he bought the property in 1875, and he deeded the southeast corner, 1/4 of that lot, to Sarah Lowe, who we are guessing was probably a slave and had been a slave, maybe raised the children or something, that he would deed that to her. In 1880, Eliza Whiting bought the rest of the property. She's the wife of Alfred Whiting, who people know from the black body servant of Isaac Brady during the Civil War. He had been released from being a slave earlier, 1830s. Him and his mother had been granted their freedom from somebody else, but he apparently worked for Isaac Brady. Then it goes to various heirs. Alfred died in 1922, and the Gallaudets bought it in 1934 by the time the heirs and everything settled. So the Beveridge family that owns it now, the deeds, and I double-checked today, the deeds still say, except for 1/4 on the corner, that was deeded to Sarah Lowe. Nobody knows who Sarah Lowe was. Okay, how that hasn't been just like forgotten, it's hard to tell. But that was where this woman lived. Another thing, when I did talk to Mrs. Beveridge briefly, she knows a lot about what was going on, like from when the Gallaudets bought it and on. And she mentioned someone who taught at the School for the Blind. And I looked it up, and it's a Miss Emily Raspberry. And lovely internet, you find all this stuff. She was born in 1915 in Alabama and got the flu and age 4 and became blind. Anyway, she ended up teaching here in 1955 after teaching at other schools and being educated, and retired in 1977. And she does show up probably, I'm guessing there's only one Emily Raspberry probably ever. She died in Vermont, and there is a gravestone up there for her, but the Find a Grave doesn't have any references to the history of that person, so it would be fun to get those facts put in. So that particular property involved the Whiting family and heirs of the Banks family, and Marshall Banks had been a barber here in town.
When I think of the Beveridge family, I think of a house 1 block off of the campus, across from the parking lot of the Key Funeral Home. Do they own it?
It's closer. It's the part that's right on the corner of Antigo. It's not that one. It's this one. I mean, Key Funeral Home. We'll discuss this property in a minute, but Beveridge's own.
End of Antigo.
Yeah, right there on the corner, and it's one of the few lots in town where it is still the whole lot, except for the 1/4 part that was deeded elsewhere, but it hasn't been divided. There's only the one address there. That is a much newer house than the Whiting family and all that lived there. That house was built in somewhere. I think the Gallaudets built it in 1934, so they would have torn down the house that the Whitings were in. So then of course I got, okay, well, with the segregation that usually happens in towns in the past, I was curious why the colored community would have a piece of property in town. So I looked at the other 4 lots on the town on that block, and 2 of the other ones also were owned by people who had been called the colored community. Lot 83 had also been owned by Daniel Shawline and sold to Benjamin Pugh. He sold it to some Jackson brothers, and their family owned it in 1869. Their family owned it till 1942, and I haven't been able to figure out if Wes M. Lehman, who's the widow of someone, it looks like she might have inherited it from them, so she would have still been African American community. And that's the one, the Haynes, that's the Haynes owns that piece, that kind of old white house with lots of bushes around it across from McKee. That's the Haynes family owns that house.
Lot 83?
Lot 83.
Okay. It's Linda James' house.
That's Ben's house, right?
It's Ben now, but yeah. I have some more details here if you really want to look at it, but I'm just giving you some overnotes. In fact, that house on the corner is number 190 North Grafton, even though it's on Birch, but the front door is North Grafton. Reuben Austin bought that in 1875, so the property got split somewhere in there between 1869 and 1875. The Jacksons owned the property that would be this direction, and Austin owned on the corner. He's the father of Cornelius Austin, who had a restaurant here in town, which I think is in the building that's the main part of Patty Anderson's shop, the Little Gem restaurant. It's a little hard to tell which part of those buildings was which, but I think that's where it was. And so there were several Austins in the community, and that house was built while the Austins owned it in 1900. So that is a house from the African American community. Ralph Haynes bought it in 1939 from Mary Austin, who was the widow of someone. Lot 84, which is the one closer to town. So you have, if you're looking at the map, you've got 93, 83, and 84, that's on North Grafton. So 84 is still on North Grafton on the corner of Rosemary. That was owned by a William Clayton Parker, who had been a stagecoach driver and also had a livery stable there. And I suspect he was not African American because he was buried in the Indian Mound Cemetery, so he was not part of that colored community.
Which lot is this? Lot.
It's lot 84. Yeah, it's on the corner of East Rosemary and North Grafton. I'm now trying to picture which house that is. So lot 94, which is next to it, but so it's on East Rosemary and North Antigo on that corner by the school. That house on the corner, it's 197, it was built in the 1930s when Robert Singleton owned it, and he was one of the barbers in town. I think he and his brother Alexander were barbers. Before that, Abraham and William Banks had owned it starting in 1870. So right around 1869, 1870, these families bought those 3 lots and lived there for quite a while. The Singleton family owned it from 1921 to 1969. Abraham and William, who bought it in 1870, Uncle William had a confectionery store there. And it's across from the Rose Pancake House. Whichever house that is. It's the Pancake family. Mount Pisgah Cemetery, which I know Jane Ailes has done a lot, and Charlie Hall and everything. They've done a lot with that. So, of course, I had to create a spreadsheet. I combined a couple things, which I think are both on the Historic Hampshire .org site. Hello again. They have a list of people buried in the cemetery. They also have a link to a list of African Americans who died in Hampshire County. And it's not always clear where they were buried, but it is some more information about birth dates and death dates. And I've been known to wipe out entire computer systems with my
Magnetic personality.
Yeah. Walk into a store and the computer system crashed. And then I found a whole bunch more information, and so I've been continuing to build on that. But it's very interesting of the different families who lived here in the area. Find a Grave has a whole lot of information and links. Hello. And I really enjoy doing this kind of research, and it distracts me, and I wander off. But again, some of the people that lived in Holtzville are buried there. It's very unclear where the rest of them went, and they were semi-prominent families in the colored community. So, Ebenezer Cemetery. I guess there's a rumor that there was an Armstrong Cemetery in town that disappeared, but it may have been before this era that these people would have been dying. And a lot of people did move away. Someone had asked me recently about the lack of diversity in our community. Where's the African Americans? Where's the Black community? And I finally realized from what I'm observing that at some points in the past of Hampshire County and Romney, with various depressions and all, that a lot of people probably moved west after the Civil War, after the 1920s depression, 1930s. People, I can tell from some of my research that people went to Pittsburgh to work in factories and things like that. But then I realized a lot of people left. It's just that when the European Americans left, you don't notice, because you still have a whole lot of them left. When the African American community left, it leaves a big hole in our diversity. But when you read the old newspapers, you'll find out they had a lot of fun. The Mount Pisgah Church, they were always having socials. They had, at one point, there was a trip, I think, to the beach on a bus of 80 people. And it's like, we can't even imagine what that looks like here. It's 80 African Americans walking around, going to the shops. So there used to be a really vibrant community, and I just suspect that economic considerations, they had to move, like the sons would move to the factories in Pittsburgh and not come back. The parents might get buried here in Mount Pisgah, but that was the end of that. And that's really, other than answering questions and just talking about it in general, that's really kind of all I had to present this evening. So thank you. And we have questions.
I have a question, because I don't know the history of the area that well. I'm curious, what was the broader story for the African Americans? Because I always heard that West Virginia seceded from Virginia over the slavery issue. What was kind of the bigger picture for African Americans here? Sounds like they were here, they were slaves, then they became landowners. Was Romney part of the group that wanted to secede from Virginia? Does anybody know that?
Some people will say that the ballot boxes were stuffed and that nobody in West Virginia wanted to secede.
Well, there was a lot going on.
In this area, though, like McNeil's Rangers, Samuel Brady, a lot of people. And if you go to the maybe I can just do Morse code. If you go to Indian Mound Cemetery, there's a lot of Confederate soldiers here. So, but this was one of those areas where there weren't very many slaves per person. There weren't like huge plantations like in the South at all. So it was, while wanting to be on the side of the Confederacy was an issue for the European settlers here, it wasn't quite as slave-driven, I think, as the South would have been, because people didn't have that many slaves.
Makes sense. And I did hear, I think at the Harvest Festival, they had some history presentations. And I heard that Romney changed hands during the Civil War like 50 times or something crazy back and forth.
Which is exaggerated. However, one side came in the morning and left, and the next side came in the afternoon, so.
I think officially it's only like really 2 or 3 times that either side held on to it for a while. Is that something like that? Yeah.
And one more question, I'm sorry. So you
That's
mentioned
okay.
a lot of the African American community passed on and then people moved out. Around what era, time was that? Was it around the turn of the century where a lot of people kind of industrial revolution were moving to the city?
I think if I could coordinate my spreadsheet at some point, I'd find that a lot of it probably didn't even happen to World War II.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure, like the Mount Pisgah Church, that there's still recent records of people who were trustees there. So there were things going on. And there's several of the people buried at Mount Pisgah Cemetery were World War I and World War II vets from the black community. So it wasn't like after the Civil War they all picked up and moved west.
And it wasn't the Industrial Revolution stuff moving to the city, so it was after.
No, yeah, it was after that, probably a little bit more related to Depression era, and that we didn't have factories in Pittsburgh did. Because Pittsburgh's not that far away, and really, as far as relocating, so.
What was that guy's name of the largest slave owner? It was your last name, right? Brady? And they had how many slaves?
Samuel Brady, he had 47.
Well, where was that farm?
Well, he had different things. He owned businesses in town. His brother Isaac actually owned 41 East Main, where Royce Seville's building is.
Yeah.
He bought that from the town after the Civil War. So there's Brady's around, and they had farms, but they had local businesses too. And I have seen ads where Samuel Brady was renting his slaves out to other people. But Samuel Brady's farm up on the border up near Crescent Town is where the McNeil Rangers stopped at night. He had a big farm up there, which is now a sewage treatment plant, I think. Ironic? I don't know.
That's a lot of slaves for this area, because I
Yeah.
think our farm, I think George William Washington in 1860 had 20 slaves. So that was,
That's a big property.
and he had, I think, around 3,000 acres.
We don't know.
George William Washington.
Yeah, I had, I think it's 20 slaves. In 1850, he had 10, I think.
This says 15. But
In
close enough.
1850? Okay.
Yeah.
What year was that?
1850.
1850.
Do you have 1860 data there? No, okay.
Only 1850 showed up on the
Okay.
researches.
I think there
had,
were
yeah.
20 in 1860, but to
Yeah,
have
it
40
makes
something, but
sense.
like you say, if they rented slaves out.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that.
And I don't know where all of Samuel Brady's properties, farms would have been, but he did have several. He was definitely one of those canny Irishmen.
Wow, yeah.
I've been trying to figure out if my Brady's on the Eastern Shore might be related to his Brady's, and they stayed there and he came here.
They say what?
If they stayed there and he came here, I don't know. I can tap on this thing. So one of the things that I've been doing over time is writing little biography chapters of the different families, and I'm up to 70 or 80 different, not the colored community, that's kind of a new thing, but like the Taylor family, the Brady family, Vanderveers, all kinds of families. So I'm kind of cross-referencing this with that to see, and that at some point hopefully have a better understanding of like who did have the bigger farms and stuff.
Where are you publishing this?
On my computer. Yeah, history-wise, I think I've only ever published one thing, and that was when what I termed the Flory Meidinger house was being formed.
Is that the oldest home in the county?
No, the oldest home in Romney is probably that log cabin part of the Wilson Woodrow Meidinger house.
Yeah, that was on that quiz on the...
Yeah. The white part of that was most likely built by Woodrow, Andrew Woodrow, who married George Wilson's daughter and inherited that property. The person who owned that before George Wilson, back in the 1760s or something, is probably who built the log cabin part.